In the Soviet Union, gifts were never just gifts. They were signals, weapons, and insurance policies wrapped in velvet and varnish. And nowhere was that clearer than in the offerings delivered sometimes with trembling hands to Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the man who by the late 1930s had turned the Communist Party into a machine that revolved around his will. In a state that officially condemned bourgeois luxury and claimed to be building a future without exploitation, the act of presenting an extravagant object to the General Secretary was not a contradiction to be explained away. It was the system revealing itself. The USSR did not abolish hierarchy, it rebranded it. And the gifts Stalin received documented in archives, memoirs, museum collections, and the photographic record of Soviet ceremonial life form a trail of evidence showing how power was performed, how fear was managed, and how loyalty was staged in the 20th century's most tightly controlled political theater. To understand why these offerings mattered, you have to understand the world they came from. Stalin was born in 1878 in Gori, in the Russian Empire's Georgian lands, and rose through the underground Bolshevik movement to become General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924, and over the next decade, Stalin outmaneuvered rivals Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin until he stood at the center of a state that was rapidly industrializing and brutalizing itself. The first five-year plan began in 1928. Collectivization followed, and with it famine and mass repression. By the time the Great Terror peaked in 1937-1938, the NKVD had arrested millions, hundreds of thousands were shot. In that atmosphere, a gift was not merely an expression of admiration. It was a political act that could be interpreted as devotion, opportunism, or if done wrong, suspicion. The Soviet system institutionalized celebration as a form of governance. Anniversaries, congresses, and jubilees became moments when the state forced society to speak in one voice. Stalin's birthdays, especially his 50th in December 1929 and his 70th in December 1949, were not private milestones, they were national campaigns. The press, factories, schools, and party committees were mobilized to produce praise. And praise, in the Soviet context, often took material form. Delegations arrived in Moscow with objects designed to embody the myth. Stalin as the wise helmsman, the father of peoples, the architect of victory, the genius of Marxism-Leninism. The gifts were frequently displayed, photographed, catalogued, and sometimes preserved in museums that functioned as temples of political religion. Above all, the Stalin Museum in Gori, established in 1937 and expanded in the post-war years. These displays were not accidental. They were a visual education in the correct relationship between citizen and leader. Extravagance, then, is not just about price tags. It is about labor, symbolism, and the risk people were willing to take to be seen offering something worthy. Many of the most striking gifts associated with Stalin were handcrafted at enormous expense of time and skill, often by collective workshops or state enterprises, and presented during carefully choreographed ceremonies. Their value lay in the message: we know what you want, we know what you represent, we know what to say to survive. One of the most recurring and telling categories was the portrait. In a dictatorship, portraits are not decoration, they are infrastructure. Stalin's face became a central icon of Soviet public space, and gift-givers competed to produce the most elaborate, technically impressive, and ideologically correct representation. There were portraits woven into carpets and tapestries, assembled from precious woods, painted on lacquered panels, carved in relief, and laid out in mosaics. Some were made from unusual materials, semi-precious stones, grains, seeds, even butterfly wings in certain propaganda crafts of the era, because novelty itself was a form of devotion. These were not the simple oil paintings that hung in offices. These were monumental objects, sometimes meters wide, designed to overwhelm the viewer with the sense that Stalin was not merely a man, but an element of the natural world. Solid as stone, radiant as the sun, permanent as history. In the Soviet republics and the broader Eastern sphere, local traditions were mobilized to reinforce the center's authority. From Central Asia came ornate textiles and carpets, often featuring Stalin's image or slogans woven into the pattern. Carpet making was labor-intensive, and the transformation of a traditional craft into a vehicle for political worship was itself a statement. The old culture now served the new ruler. From the Caucasus, including Stalin's native Georgia, came carved woodwork, metalwork, and finely crafted objects that played on regional pride while binding it to loyalty. These pieces were often presented by workers' collectives, kolkhoz delegations, or party organizations, because in Soviet ritual the people did not appear as individuals, they appeared as organized masses. The most extravagant gifts also included objects that were, in effect, miniature monuments. Models of factories, hydroelectric stations, and industrial complexes were crafted and presented as tributes. These were not random choices. Stalin's legitimacy after the late 1920s rested heavily on industrialization, on the claim that he had transformed a backward empire into a modern power. A scale model of a blast furnace or a dam was propaganda in 3 dimensions. It told the story the state wanted told. Under Stalin, the country builds. Under Stalin, steel flows. Under Stalin, electricity reaches the villages. The irony, of course, was that many of these achievements were built with forced labor. The Gulag system expanded dramatically in the 1930s and 1940s, and major projects, canals, mines, railways were driven by prisoners working under lethal conditions. When a model of an industrial triumph was placed before Stalin as a gift, it was often a polished mask covering the violence that made the real structure possible. Among the most politically charged gifts were those connected to war and victory. The Second World War, known in the USSR as the Great Patriotic War, became the defining event of Stalin's later rule. Nazi Germany invaded on 22 June 1941. The Soviet Union suffered catastrophic losses. Entire armies encircled, cities besieged, millions dead. But by 1943, the tide turned at Stalingrad and Kursk, and by May 1945, the Red Army took Berlin. Post-war Soviet legitimacy leaned heavily on the narrative of victory, and Stalin was positioned as the supreme strategist, even though the early disasters of 1941 were inseparable from Stalin's own decisions, including the purges of the officer corps and the refusal to accept intelligence warnings of the invasion. In the victory cult that followed, gifts often took the form of military-themed art objects, engraved weapons, ceremonial sabers, ornate cases containing medals, and elaborate representations of battle scenes. Not all such items were meant for practical use. Many were display pieces designed to fuse Stalin's image with the Red Army's triumph. The question of extravagant gifts becomes more concrete when we look at what was preserved and where. The Stalin Museum in Gori, still standing today, has long displayed a collection of gifts attributed to Stalin, including ornate textiles, decorative objects, and items presented by foreign delegations. While museum politics and the framing of such collections have shifted over time, especially after de-Stalinization began in the mid-1950s, the physical existence of these objects underscores a basic fact. Stalin was the recipient of a steady stream of material tribute, and the state made a point of preserving at least some of it. That preservation itself is telling. Even after Stalin's death in March 1953, when Nikita Khrushchev began dismantling the cult and denouncing Stalin's crimes, most famously in his secret speech to the 20th Party Congress on 25 February 1956, the material residue of the cult did not vanish overnight. Objects remained in storage, in museums, in archives, and in the memories of those who had made them. Foreign gifts carried a different kind of electricity. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union was diplomatically isolated in many respects, but it also attracted leftist admiration abroad. Western intellectuals, artists, and fellow travelers visited and sometimes participated in the performance of Soviet modernity. In those years, the gifts that mattered most were not necessarily the most expensive objects, but those that signaled recognition. Diplomatic gifts from foreign governments, when they occurred, were carefully curated because they implied legitimacy on the international stage. After 1941, when the USSR became an ally of Britain and the United States against Nazi Germany, the diplomatic environment shifted dramatically. Stalin met Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt at the Tehran Conference in November-December 1943, at Yalta in February 1945, and though Roosevelt died in April 1945, the wartime alliance left behind a complex legacy of gestures, honors, and diplomatic exchanges. The Cold War would harden soon after, but during the war, the optics of respect mattered. Stalin's image as a partner in defeating Hitler was valuable to all sides, and the Soviet leadership understood the power of ceremonial exchange. Yet the most extravagant gifts were often domestic, because the Soviet domestic economy of fear and favor created incentives for excess. In a system where a regional party boss could be arrested for failing to meet quotas or for being associated with a purged patron, the safest course was to demonstrate enthusiasm. And enthusiasm, in the Soviet language of ritual, was measured in scale. The bigger the offering, the louder the praise. This dynamic produced absurdities: enormous greeting addresses signed by thousands, albums of photographs documenting achievements dedicated to Stalin, and lavish objects that consumed scarce resources. The contradiction was glaring. The country endured rationing, housing shortages, and periodic hunger, yet precious materials and skilled labor were diverted to produce ceremonial tributes. The point was not comfort. The point was allegiance. Stalin's 70th birthday in December 1949 is a key moment for understanding the late-stage extravagance of the cult. By then, the Soviet Union had emerged from the war victorious but devastated. Entire regions were in ruins, tens of millions were dead, cities like Stalingrad had been reduced to rubble. Reconstruction was underway, but living standards remained harsh. At the same time, the USSR had detonated its first atomic bomb on 29 August 1949, ending the American monopoly and intensifying the Cold War. Stalin's leadership was framed as both the source of victory and the guarantor of security in a nuclear age. The birthday celebrations were enormous, and gifts poured in from across the Soviet republics and from newly established socialist states in Eastern Europe. The political message was unambiguous. The post-war order in the Soviet sphere rested on Stalin's authority, and everyone who mattered would be seen honoring it. From the Eastern Bloc countries that had fallen under Soviet influence after 1945, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the German Democratic Republic after 1949, gifts served as declarations of alignment. Leaders in these states were building their own Stalinist systems, often through purges and show trials. In such an environment, a gift to Stalin was not just a diplomatic courtesy. It was a pledge of obedience. When Eastern European delegations presented ornate objects, they were also presenting themselves, hoping to be recognized as loyal administrators of the Soviet model. The consequences of misalignment were not theoretical. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw intense political repression across the bloc, and Moscow's approval could determine a leader's fate. Some of the most visually extravagant offerings were the ones that merged folk art with Stalin's portrait. This was a deliberate strategy to show that the leader was not imposed from above, but embraced from below, woven into the people's traditions. In reality, much of this spontaneous devotion was orchestrated. Soviet cultural policy under Stalin promoted national in form, socialist in content, meaning local cultural styles were encouraged only insofar as they carried Soviet ideology. A carpet with Stalin's face or a lacquer box depicting him among happy peasants was not a quaint artifact. It was the visual proof of that doctrine. It said, "Even the old crafts now speak the language of the party." Another category of extravagance came from the industrial ministries and scientific institutions. Precision-crafted models, commemorative instruments, and elaborate presentations celebrating technological milestones. In Stalin's USSR, science and technology were political. The state demanded breakthroughs and treated failure as sabotage. The 1930s had seen catastrophic episodes like the famine and the chaos of forced collectivization, but they also saw spectacular industrial growth, often at a terrible human cost. By the late 1940s, the Soviet state was racing to match and surpass Western military and technological power. Gifts that celebrated engineering and scientific prowess were a way of telling Stalin, "Your strategy works. Your enemies will be defeated. History is on your side." But they also reflected the terror underlying Soviet science, where entire fields could be destroyed by political decisions, most famously genetics, under Trofim Lysenko, whose anti-Mendelian doctrines were supported at high levels and contributed to the persecution of scientists and long-term damage to Soviet biology. In that climate, a lavish tribute from a scientific institute could also be read as self-defense. Stalin's personal relationship to luxury was complicated, and that complexity is part of why these gifts are so revealing. Stalin cultivated an image of simplicity, the revolutionary who had not succumbed to bourgeois decadence. Yet he lived at the center of a privileged system: dachas, security, special supply networks, and a court-like inner circle. The Soviet elite enjoyed access to goods and services unavailable to ordinary citizens, and Stalin's own residences were supplied through state channels. The gifts did not create that privilege, they performed it. They made it visible in a controlled way, while the propaganda continued to insist that the leader was a selfless servant of the people. Some offerings were extravagant not because they were jeweled, but because they represented immense collective labor. Consider the phenomenon of giant commemorative albums and addresses. Soviet institutions would produce massive volumes, sometimes bound in ornate covers filled with calligraphy, photographs, reports of production achievements, and signatures. These were not casual scrapbooks. They were produced by teams, often using scarce materials, and presented as unique artifacts. The content followed a formula. The collective had exceeded the plan, increased output, improved discipline, and dedicated these successes to Stalin. The gift was the physical embodiment of a political relationship. We produce, you lead; we praise, you protect. It was a contract written in ink and fear. The most grotesque extravagance, in a moral sense, lies in the timing. Many of the grandest tributes were produced during or after periods of mass suffering. In the early 1930s, as collectivization tore through the countryside and famine struck most catastrophically in Ukraine in 1930-1933, alongside severe hunger in other regions, public praise of Stalin intensified rather than diminished. The state's propaganda blamed kulaks, saboteurs, and enemies, while the leader was presented as the solver of problems the system itself was creating. In such a world, an extravagant gift could function as a kind of moral laundering. It replaced the reality of hunger with the image of abundance. A richly woven textile or a gilded commemorative object implied prosperity even when the villages that produced it were barely surviving. During the war, the dynamic shifted but did not disappear. The Soviet population endured unimaginable hardship. The siege of Leningrad lasted from September 1941 to January 1944 and killed well over 1 million people, many by starvation. Yet the cult of leadership remained central. Wartime propaganda elevated Stalin as supreme commander, and post-war celebrations cast victory as the culmination of his genius. Gifts linked to victory: commemorative objects, artistic depictions of military triumph, symbolic offerings from liberated territories became part of the story that justified the post-war order. The consequences were profound. By framing victory as inseparable from Stalin, the regime made criticism of Stalin feel like betrayal of the dead. That emotional blackmail helped sustain repression even after the war ended. There were also gifts that were extravagant because they were dangerous. In Stalin's court, being noticed could be as risky as being ignored. A regional leader who sent an overly lavish tribute might be accused of flattery, corruption, or cultivating a personal relationship with Stalin that implied political ambition. Soviet politics was filled with such traps. The safest gifts were those that followed the approved aesthetic and ideological line. That is why so many offerings look similar. Stalin's portrait, symbols of industry and agriculture, scenes of happy workers, slogans of loyalty. Originality could be interpreted as deviation. Even extravagance had to be standardized. This is where the deeper context matters. Stalin's rule was not only about personal paranoia, it was about the creation of a political environment in which everyone acted as if paranoia was rational. The Great Terror did not require Stalin to personally target every victim. It required a system in which officials preemptively proved their loyalty, denounced others, and competed in displays of devotion. Extravagant gifts were one of the most visible, material forms of that competition. They were not the cause of repression, but they were evidence of its logic. When a factory collective spent weeks producing an ornate portrait or model to present to Stalin, that labor was also a rehearsal of obedience. It trained people to treat the leader as the source of meaning. The international dimension adds another layer. After 1945, Stalin's Soviet Union became the center of a global ideological camp. Communist parties around the world, from France to China, navigated their relationships with Moscow. In the late 1940s, Stalin's influence over the emerging People's Republic of China was substantial but not absolute, and the Sino-Soviet relationship was marked by both cooperation and tension. Mao Zedong traveled to Moscow in December 1949 and remained into early 1950, negotiating the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance, signed on 14 February 1950. That visit itself was heavy with symbolism. In such encounters, gifts and ceremonial gestures were part of the grammar of power. They signaled who was senior, who was seeking support, and who was granting recognition. Even when the exact objects exchanged are less famous than the meetings themselves, the practice of gift-giving in high diplomacy mattered because it translated ideology into ritual. The Soviet Union claimed to be building a world without exploitation, yet it still operated with imperial-style ceremonies in which tribute flowed toward the center. What then were the most extravagant gifts Stalin received? The honest answer, grounded in the historical record, is that extravagance came less from a single legendary object and more from the sheer volume and orchestration of tribute. Monumental portraits in precious materials, carpets and tapestries requiring vast labor, ornate folk art pieces repurposed into political icons, industrial models celebrating projects built through coercion, and diplomatic offerings that signaled international legitimacy. The gifts were extravagant in material, in labor, and in meaning. They were not isolated curiosities, they were components of a system. Still, certain types of objects stand out because they encapsulate the Soviet paradox in one frame. A carpet portrait of Stalin is not merely decorative. It is the fusion of traditional craft with totalitarian iconography. It turns a domestic object, something meant for warmth, into a political surface. It brings the leader into the home, literally underfoot or on the wall, making ideology intimate. A mosaic or portrait made from semi-precious stones is not just expensive, it is geological propaganda, implying that Stalin's image is as enduring as the earth. A model of a dam or factory is not just a toy, it is a claim that the state's violence has been transmuted into progress. And a massive commemorative album signed by thousands is not just paper, it is the written performance of unanimity, the insistence that everyone thinks the same thing, because in Stalin's USSR, the appearance of unity was a survival mechanism. The consequences of this culture of tribute did not end with Stalin's death on 5 March 1953. The Soviet leadership immediately faced the problem of succession and the danger of a system built around one man. Lavrentiy Beria, Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Nikita Khrushchev maneuvered for power. Within 3 years, Khrushchev would denounce Stalin's cult of personality and the mass repressions, initiating a process known as de-Stalinization. Statues came down in many places. Stalin's body was removed from the Lenin Mausoleum in 1961. But the habit Stalinism created ritualized praise, bureaucratic fear, the use of public symbols to enforce private obedience did not evaporate. They mutated. Soviet political culture remained deeply ceremonial, and the state continued to rely on controlled narratives and staged unanimity. The material afterlife of Stalin's gifts is part of that story. Objects survive even when regimes change their slogans. Museums, archives, and private collections preserve the artifacts of the cult, sometimes as historical evidence, sometimes as contested heritage. In places like Gori, Stalin's legacy has remained politically sensitive, caught between local pride, national memory, and the broader historical verdict on his crimes. The gifts displayed there are not neutral. They are fragments of a system that demanded visible devotion and punished ambiguity. When modern visitors look at them, they are not just seeing craftsmanship, they are seeing the aesthetic of coercion. And that is the final takeaway. The extravagance of Stalin's gifts was not a personal quirk of a dictator who liked shiny objects. It was a structural feature of a political order that replaced free speech with ritual, replaced trust with performance, and replaced accountability with spectacle. In Stalin's Soviet Union, people did not simply obey, they demonstrated obedience again and again in forms that could be photographed, archived, and displayed. The gifts were part of a feedback loop. The more the cult grew, the more tribute was demanded. The more tribute was offered, the more the cult appeared natural and universal. That loop helped Stalin maintain power through terror and myth, and it left behind a lesson that still matters. When a political system trains citizens and officials to survive by offering symbolic tribute to a leader, extravagance becomes a language of fear. And even decades later, the artifacts of that language remain beautiful, disturbing, and impossible to separate from the human cost that made them possible.